Lieutenant Sarah Chen stepped out of her rental car and looked up at the towering brick buildings of the Naval Academy. The autumn wind whipped through the courtyard, carrying the sharp scent of salt water from the nearby harbor. She adjusted her uniform and picked up her briefcase, feeling the weight of the mission ahead. Sarah had been sent here under a false identity. To everyone at the academy, she was just another new instructor, fresh from a desk job at the Pentagon. Nobody knew about her real background: 12 years as a Navy SEAL, countless classified missions, or the Purple Heart hidden in her apartment back home. The Navy had chosen her specifically for this assignment because she could blend in, observe, and gather intelligence without raising suspicion. The problem was serious. For months, reports had been flooding in about harassment and bullying at the academy. Female cadets were dropping out at alarming rates, and those who stayed were too frightened to speak up. The official investigations had turned up nothing. The perpetrators were smart, careful, and well-connected. They knew how to avoid the cameras and silence their victims. That's where Sarah came in. She would pose as a civilian instructor, teaching maritime history, giving her access to both faculty areas and cadet dormitories. Her mission was simple but dangerous: find evidence of the harassment ring and identify the leaders before more careers were destroyed. Walking through the main entrance, Sarah noticed how the male cadets looked at her, some with curiosity, others with barely concealed contempt. She had dealt with this attitude her entire military career, but it still stung. These young men had no idea what she had sacrificed for their freedom to act like entitled children. Her first week passed quietly. Sarah taught her classes, ate in the faculty dining room, and slowly began mapping out the social dynamics of the academy. She noticed which cadets held real power, which professors turned blind eyes to obvious problems, and which areas of campus seemed to operate under different rules. The breakthrough came on a Thursday evening. Sarah was working late in her office when she heard voices in the hallway. Through her slightly open door, she watched 3 senior cadets corner a younger female cadet near the stairwell. Their body language told the whole story: intimidation, fear, and abuse of power. "Listen carefully," the tallest cadet whispered to the frightened girl. "You keep your mouth shut about what happened in the locker room, or things will get much worse for you. We run this place, not you." The girl nodded rapidly and hurried away, tears streaming down her face. The 3 cadets laughed and high-fived each other before disappearing around the corner. Sarah memorized their faces and checked her watch. This was the evidence she needed to start building her case. Over the next few days, Sarah began following these 3 cadets: Marcus Webb, the son of a Navy admiral; Jake Morrison, whose father owned half the defense contractors in Virginia; and Tommy Rodriguez, the grandson of a Medal of Honor recipient. They were untouchable, or so they believed. Sarah discovered their pattern. Every Tuesday and Thursday night, after official lights out, they would gather a group of 8 to 10 other cadets for what they called tradition enforcement. This involved targeting female cadets, international students, or anyone they perceived as weak or different. Their favorite hunting ground was the shower facility in Building C. It was an older building with poor lighting and no security cameras in that particular wing. They had somehow obtained master keys and would trap their victims inside, subjecting them to humiliation, threats, and worse. Sarah knew she needed to catch them in the act, but it meant putting herself at tremendous risk. If they discovered her real identity too soon, not only would her mission fail, but these criminals would likely escape justice forever. She spent hours planning her approach. Considering every possible outcome, the opportunity came sooner than expected. On a rainy Tuesday night, Sarah was reviewing files in her office when she heard the familiar sound of hushed voices and footsteps moving toward Building C. Through her window, she could see shadowy figures crossing the courtyard with military precision. She grabbed her hidden camera and recording device, both disguised as everyday items, and slipped out of her office. Moving silently through the corridors, Sarah followed the group at a safe distance. Her SEAL training kicked in automatically. Controlled breathing, careful foot placement, constant awareness of her surroundings. The group entered Building C through a side door that should have been locked. Sarah waited 30 seconds before following them inside. The building was dark except for emergency lighting, creating long shadows that provided perfect cover for her surveillance. She could hear voices coming from the shower area at the end of the main corridor. Moving closer, Sarah positioned herself behind a maintenance alcove where she could observe and record without being detected. What she saw made her blood boil. 6 cadets had surrounded a young woman who couldn't have been more than 19 years old. She was fully clothed but soaking wet, shivering both from cold and terror. Marcus Webb stood directly in front of her, his voice dripping with menace. "This is what happens when you don't show proper respect," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Maybe next time you'll think twice before reporting one of us to the administration." The other cadets laughed and made crude comments, while the victim stood frozen in fear. Sarah recognized her from the engineering department. Bright, hard-working, and now being destroyed by these predators. Jake Morrison stepped forward with a bucket of ice water. "This is just the beginning," he announced. "We own this place, and we own you. Cross us again, and you'll find out what real consequences look like." Sarah's finger hovered over the record button on her hidden camera. She had them dead to rights, but something felt wrong. The group seemed unusually excited tonight, more aggressive than their previous activities suggested. Were they escalating their behavior? Or was this a special occasion? Her question was answered when Tommy Rodriguez pulled out his phone and began filming the humiliation. "This is going in our collection," he announced proudly. "Along with all the others. Insurance policies, we call them. Try to report us, and these videos get posted everywhere." Now Sarah understood the full scope of their operation. This wasn't just bullying. It was systematic blackmail and exploitation. They were creating compromising material to ensure their victims' silence while building an archive of their crimes like trophies. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. The victim was starting to hyperventilate, and the perpetrators were becoming more aggressive. Sarah had enough evidence to start building a case, but she couldn't stand by and watch this young woman be traumatized any further. She made a tactical decision that would change everything. Instead of remaining hidden and continuing to gather evidence, Sarah stepped out of the shadows and walked calmly toward the shower area. She needed to intervene before permanent damage was done, even if it meant blowing her cover. "Excuse me," she called out in her most authoritative voice. "What exactly is going on here?" The 6 cadets spun around in shock. They had believed themselves completely safe from discovery in their carefully chosen location. Marcus Webb quickly moved to block Sarah's view of the victim while Jake Morrison pocketed his phone. "Just some late-night study group activities, ma'am," Marcus said with fake politeness. "Nothing that concerns you." Sarah stepped closer, her military bearing becoming more pronounced despite her civilian clothes. She could see the fear in the young woman's eyes and the guilty panic spreading through the group of perpetrators. "It concerns me very much," Sarah replied coldly, "especially since this young lady appears to be in distress." The tension in the room skyrocketed. The cadets exchanged nervous glances, suddenly realizing that their carefully maintained secret might be in jeopardy. They had grown comfortable, operating with impunity, never imagining that someone might challenge their authority. Tommy Rodriguez stepped forward aggressively. "Look, lady, I don't know who you think you are, but you need to mind your own business and walk away. This is academy business." Sarah smiled, but there was no warmth in it. These boys had no idea what they were dealing with. She had faced enemy combatants in some of the most dangerous places on Earth. A group of spoiled cadets didn't frighten her in the slightest. "I'm making it my business," she said quietly. "And you're going to let this young woman leave. Right now." The standoff had begun. Sarah stood alone, against 6 larger, younger men, who believed they held all the power. What they didn't know was that they had just cornered one of the most dangerous people in the entire Navy. The trap they thought they had set was about to become their own prison. Marcus Webb's face darkened as he realized this civilian instructor wasn't going to back down like everyone else had. He was used to people looking the other way, or making excuses to avoid confrontation. His father's reputation usually provided enough protection that he rarely faced direct challenges to his authority. "You're making a big mistake," Marcus said, his voice taking on a threatening edge. "Do you know who my father is? Admiral Webb doesn't appreciate people interfering with academy traditions. Maybe you should reconsider your career choices." Sarah almost laughed at the pathetic attempt at intimidation. She had been threatened by Taliban commanders, cartel leaders, and international terrorists. A spoiled admiral's son rattling his daddy's credentials was about as frightening as a paper cut. "Your father isn't here," Sarah replied calmly. "And this isn't a tradition, it's assault. Now step aside and let her leave." The victim, a young cadet named Emma Martinez, looked back and forth between Sarah and her tormentors with desperate hope. She had reported the harassment once before, only to be told there wasn't enough evidence to pursue an investigation. The retaliation had been swift and brutal, making her too scared to try again. Jake Morrison moved closer to Sarah, trying to use his size to intimidate her. At 6'3" and 200 pounds of muscle, he was used to people backing down when he invaded their personal space. "Listen, Teach. You don't understand how things work around here. Some lessons can't be learned in classrooms." "You're right," Sarah said, her voice growing dangerously quiet. "Some lessons can only be learned through experience. Would you like a demonstration?" The subtle shift in Sarah's posture sent warning signals through Jake's subconscious. But his arrogance overrode his survival instincts. He had never met anyone who didn't eventually bow to pressure from his group, certainly not a small civilian woman who probably spent her days reading dusty history books. Tommy Rodriguez laughed nervously, sensing the growing tension but not understanding its source. "Come on, guys, let's just finish up here and get going. This crazy teacher isn't worth our time." "Actually, I think she is," Marcus said, his eyes narrowing with calculated malice. "She's seen too much already. Maybe she needs the same lesson we were giving our friend here." Sarah felt the familiar calm that always descended over her before combat. These boys had just crossed a line they didn't even know existed. In their arrogance and entitlement, they had mistaken her for a helpless victim instead of a predator, far more dangerous than they could imagine. "Emma," Sarah said without taking her eyes off Marcus, "walk to the door and wait outside. Don't go far." The frightened cadet didn't need to be told twice. She quickly moved toward the exit, but Jake Morrison stepped sideways to block her path. "Nobody's leaving until we're finished here," he announced. That was Sarah's signal. In one fluid motion, she grabbed Jake's extended arm, twisted it behind his back, and used his own momentum to drive him face first into the nearest wall. The impact echoed through the shower room like a gunshot. The remaining 5 cadets stared in shock as their largest member slumped to the floor, dazed and bleeding from his nose. Sarah hadn't even seemed to exert effort. The entire takedown had taken less than 3 seconds and looked almost casual. "Emma, go," Sarah commanded, and this time, nothing blocked the young woman's escape. Marcus Webb's face went pale as he finally realized they weren't dealing with an ordinary instructor. "What the hell are you?" he whispered. "Someone you should have left alone," Sarah replied, moving to put herself between the remaining cadets and the exit. "Now, we're going to have a different kind of lesson." Tommy Rodriguez pulled out his phone again, but this time to call for backup rather than record evidence. "I'm calling security," he announced, trying to sound authoritative despite the tremor in his voice. Sarah smiled and shook her head. "Go ahead. I'd love to explain to security why 6 male cadets trapped a female student in an isolated shower room after midnight. I'm sure that conversation will go well for you." The horrible realization began dawning on the group that their usual advantages had disappeared. Their size, numbers, and political connections meant nothing in this moment. They were facing someone who operated by completely different rules. "You can't touch us," Marcus said desperately. "We're Federal Academy cadets. There are laws protecting us from assault by civilians." There are also laws protecting students from sexual harassment and kidnapping, Sarah replied coldly. But you never seem concerned about those. Funny how legal protection only matters when you're the one who needs it. Jake Morrison struggled to his feet, blood still streaming from his nose. His humiliation was complete, taken down by a woman half his size in front of his followers. The power dynamic that had defined his entire academy experience had just been shattered. "This isn't over," he snarled, but his voice lacked conviction. For the first time in his life, Jake had encountered someone he couldn't intimidate, overpower, or buy off. The experience was terrifying and infuriating in equal measure. "Actually, it is over," Sarah said firmly. "Your reign of terror ends tonight. The evidence I've gathered will be more than enough to destroy your careers and send you to federal prison." "What evidence?" Tommy demanded. "You just got here. You don't know anything about anything." Sarah pulled out her hidden recording device and held it up for them to see. "I know about every Tuesday and Thursday night for the past month. I know about your blackmail videos. I know about the master keys and the systematic targeting of vulnerable students. Should I continue?" The color drained from all their faces as the full scope of their exposure became clear. They had been so careful, so clever in their planning. How had one woman managed to uncover everything in just a few weeks? "Who are you really?" Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Before Sarah could answer, the sound of running footsteps echoed through the corridor outside. Emma Martinez had found help, and it was arriving fast. The door burst open as two security guards rushed in, followed by the academy's duty officer and the dean of students. "What's going on here?" the duty officer demanded, taking in the scene. 6 disheveled cadets, one bleeding, facing off against a small woman in civilian clothes, who somehow looked completely in control of the situation. "These cadets were assaulting a female student," Sarah said calmly. "I intervened to stop them. The victim is waiting outside, and will need medical attention for shock and hypothermia." "That's a lie," Marcus shouted desperately. "She attacked us. She's some kind of crazy person who doesn't belong here." The dean of students, Dr. Patricia Williams, looked between the parties with growing suspicion. She had been dealing with harassment complaints for months, but could never gather enough evidence to act. Now she was seeing the perpetrators she had long suspected caught in the act. "Mr. Morrison," she said, looking at Jake's bloody face, "how exactly did you sustain those injuries?" Jake glanced around frantically, realizing that any explanation would sound ridiculous. How could he admit that a middle-aged female instructor had overpowered him without making himself look pathetic? How could he explain their presence in the shower room at midnight without revealing their criminal activities? "We were conducting a training exercise," Tommy said weakly, but even he didn't sound convinced by his own words. Dr. Williams turned to Sarah with newfound respect. "And you are?" "Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen, United States Navy," Sarah said, dropping her cover identity for the first time since arriving at the academy. "I've been conducting an undercover investigation into systematic harassment and assault at this facility." The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus Webb's mouth fell open as he realized he had just threatened to end the career of a senior naval officer. Jake Morrison looked like he might vomit. The security guards unconsciously straightened their posture in the presence of someone who outranked everyone in the room except the dean. "Lieutenant Commander," Dr. Williams said carefully, "what exactly have you discovered?" Sarah reached into her jacket and pulled out a thick folder of documentation she had been building over the past month. Photos, recordings, witness statements, and a detailed timeline of criminal activities stretching back over 2 years. A sophisticated operation involving blackmail, sexual assault, kidnapping, and conspiracy, Sarah said matter-of-factly. These 6 cadets, along with approximately 12 others, have been systematically targeting vulnerable students for abuse. They've driven at least 15 young women to drop out of the academy and traumatized dozens more. The duty officer stepped forward to examine the evidence while the security guards moved to positions blocking any escape routes. The cadets' nightmare was just beginning, but they still didn't understand the full scope of what they were facing. "This is impossible," Marcus said desperately. "She's been here for 3 weeks. How could she know all of this?" Sarah fixed him with the cold stare that had intimidated enemy combatants in war zones around the world. "Because I'm very good at my job, cadet. And my job was hunting predators exactly like you." The realization hit them like a physical blow. They hadn't just attacked a random instructor who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. They had walked directly into the trap of a professional hunter who had spent weeks preparing for this exact moment. Dr. Williams finished reviewing the evidence file and looked up with grim satisfaction. After months of frustrated attempts to address the harassment problem, she finally had everything needed to clean house completely. "Gentlemen," she announced to the 6 cadets, "you are all under arrest, pending formal charges. Your academy careers are over as of this moment, and I suspect your legal troubles are just beginning." The sound of additional footsteps announced the arrival of military police officers who had been summoned to handle the arrests. Sarah had coordinated with them in advance, knowing that this confrontation would eventually require official intervention. As handcuffs were placed on the perpetrators, Marcus Webb made one final desperate attempt to salvage his future. "My father will hear about this. You can't do this to us. We have rights." Sarah stepped closer to him, her voice low enough that only he could hear. "Your father already knows. He's the one who requested this investigation after the 3rd Admiral's daughter dropped out of the academy citing harassment. He'll be waiting for you when you get home." The color completely left Marcus's face as he realized his family connections wouldn't save him this time. In fact, they made his situation infinitely worse. Admiral Webb's reputation for integrity meant he would be harder on his son than any court could ever be. 3 months later, Sarah Chen stood in the same courtyard where her mission had begun. But everything had changed. The Naval Academy buzzed with a different energy now. One of respect, rather than fear. Of justice, rather than intimidation. The cleanup had been swift and thorough. The trial of Marcus Webb and his accomplices had made national headlines. Military justice moved faster than civilian courts when dealing with clear-cut cases of criminal behavior by service members. The evidence Sarah had gathered was so comprehensive that all 18 perpetrators accepted plea bargains rather than face full court-martial proceedings. Marcus Webb received a dishonorable discharge and 3 years in military prison. His father, Admiral Webb, had personally delivered the verdict and made it clear that the family name would no longer protect his son's criminal behavior. Jake Morrison and Tommy Rodriguez received similar sentences, while the lesser participants faced shorter terms and lifetime bans from federal service. Sarah walked through the academic buildings, noting the changes that had occurred in her absence. New security cameras covered previously dark areas. Anonymous reporting systems allowed victims to seek help without fear of retaliation. Most importantly, a culture of accountability had replaced the previous atmosphere of entitled immunity. She stopped by the dormitory where Emma Martinez lived, curious to check on the young woman whose courage in testifying had helped convict her attackers. Emma answered her door with a bright smile that would have been impossible 3 months earlier. "Lieutenant Commander Chen," Emma exclaimed, "I heard you were back on campus. How does it feel to be a hero?" Sarah shook her head with a slight smile. "I'm not a hero, Emma. I was just doing my job. You're the hero. You survived their attacks and found the strength to tell your story in court. That took real courage." Then, Emma's eyes filled with tears, but they were tears of gratitude rather than trauma. "I never thought anyone would believe me, let alone catch them in the act. You saved my career and probably my life." The conversation was interrupted by footsteps in the hallway. Dr. Patricia Williams appeared, carrying a thick folder and wearing the satisfied expression of someone whose hard work had finally paid off. "Lieutenant Commander," she said warmly, "perfect timing. I wanted to personally deliver these to you." Sarah accepted the folder and opened it to find dozens of letters from current and former cadets. Thank you notes from students who had been terrorized but were now free to focus on their studies. Grateful messages from parents whose children had been on the verge of dropping out. Even letters from male cadets who had been horrified to learn what their classmates were doing, and were ashamed they hadn't acted sooner. One letter particularly caught Sarah's attention. It was from Rebecca Stevens, a cadet who had left the academy the previous year after a particularly brutal attack by Webb's group. She was now reapplying for admission, knowing that the culture had fundamentally changed. The ripple effects are still spreading, Dr. Williams explained. We've had 23 former students request to return and complete their educations. Alumni donations are at an all-time high, as graduates express pride in how the academy handled this crisis. Most importantly, harassment complaints have dropped to essentially zero. Sarah nodded with satisfaction. The mission had been about more than just catching criminals. It was about restoring the academy's honor and ensuring future generations of naval officers would be trained in an environment based on mutual respect rather than predatory behavior. They walked together toward the main administration building, passing groups of cadets engaged in normal activities, studying, exercising. The transformation was remarkable, but Sarah knew it required constant vigilance to maintain. "What's next for you?" Dr. Williams asked as they climbed the steps to her office. "Back to active duty," Sarah replied. "The Navy has other problems that need solving. And apparently I have a talent for undercover work. There are reports of corruption at the Pentagon that need investigating." Dr. Williams paused at her office door. "Before you go, there's something else you should know. The Secretary of the Navy has recommended you for promotion to full commander. Your work here didn't go unnoticed at the highest levels." Sarah was genuinely surprised. She had expected commendation, maybe a medal, but promotion was beyond her hopes. Her unconventional career path as a SEAL transitioning to intelligence work didn't usually lead to rapid advancement. "There's also been an unofficial request, Dr. Williams continued with a sly smile. "Several other military academies have asked if you might be available for similar assignments. Apparently, the academy harassment problem isn't limited to just us." The invitation was tempting, but Sarah had spent 12 years in special operations and was looking forward to new challenges. The undercover work had been rewarding, but she missed the direct action and clear objectives of her SEAL days. "I'll consider it," Sarah said diplomatically. "But right now, I'm needed elsewhere." Road. As they entered the administration building, Sarah noticed a familiar face waiting in the lobby. Captain James Rodriguez, Tommy's father, sat quietly, with his cover in his hands. He looked up as Sarah approached, his expression mixing shame and gratitude in equal measure. "Lieutenant Commander," he said, standing respectfully, "I wanted to thank you personally for what you did. My son needed to face consequences for his actions, and I failed to provide them. You did what I should have done years ago." Sarah studied the older officer carefully. Captain Rodriguez had built an impressive military career, but his son's criminal behavior had forced him to confront some difficult truths about parenting and accountability. "Your son made his own choices," Sarah replied. "The important thing is that he faces the consequences and learns from them. Prison isn't the end of his story if he chooses to make better decisions when he gets out." Captain Rodriguez nodded gratefully. "He's been writing letters to his victims, trying to make amends. It's a small start, but it's something. I wanted you to know that some of us parents are trying to do better too." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Admiral Webb himself. Sarah had never met Marcus's father in person, but his reputation as a man of absolute integrity preceded him. He approached with the bearing of someone who had spent decades making difficult decisions under extreme pressure. "Commander Chen," he said formally, then extended his hand. "Thank you for your service to the Navy and to justice. What my son did was inexcusable, and I'm grateful it was stopped before more damage could be done." 8. Sarah shook his hand, noting the firm grip and direct eye contact of a leader who faced problems head-on rather than making excuses. "Your son's actions don't reflect on you, Admiral. You can't control the choices adult children make. Perhaps, Admiral Webb replied. But I can control how I respond to those choices. Marcus will serve his full sentence, without any interference from me. When he's released, he'll need to rebuild his life through his own efforts, not through family connections. The brief conversation ended with mutual respect. Sarah could see why Admiral Webb was considered one of the Navy's finest leaders. He applied the same standards to his family that he demanded from his subordinates. Dr. Williams led Sarah to a private conference room where they could discuss the broader implications of the investigation. Maps and organizational charts covered one wall, showing connections between the Academy scandal and similar problems at other military institutions. This was bigger than we initially realized, Dr. Williams explained. Your investigation uncovered a network of harassment that extended beyond just our academy. Social media groups, shared strategies, even coordination between institutions to target specific individuals. Sarah studied the evidence with growing concern. What she had thought was an isolated problem at one academy was actually part of a systematic culture of abuse that had infected multiple levels of military education. The other academies are requesting similar investigations, Dr. Williams continued. The Air Force Academy, the Military Academy at West Point, even some of the service colleges. Your methods proved so effective that they want to replicate your approach. The scope of the problem was staggering, but Sarah felt a surge of determination rather than discouragement. She had spent her career protecting Americans from foreign threats, but domestic enemies were just as dangerous in their own way. I'll need a team, Sarah said, after reviewing all the evidence. This is too big for one person to handle alone. Thank you for watching. There's looking this head rhyme, and we'll need support from the very highest levels of command to overcome the political pressure we'll face. Dr. Williams smiled with anticipation. Already arranged. The Secretary of Defense personally approved a joint task force to address military academy harassment. You'll have resources, personnel, and complete authority to investigate wherever the evidence leads. As their meeting concluded, Sarah walked outside to find the sun setting over the academy grounds. Cadets were finishing their evening activities and heading to dormitories for study time. The scene looked peaceful and normal, but Sarah now knew how much work had gone into creating that normalcy. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Emma Martinez. Lieutenant Commander, I just wanted you to know that I made the Dean's List this semester. For the first time since starting here, I can focus on my studies instead of looking over my shoulder. Thank you for giving me my life back. Sarah smiled and typed back. You did that yourself, Emma. I just helped clear the path. Keep making us proud. Keep making us proud. Making us proud. I'm anyone. As she walked back to her car, Sarah reflected on the unexpected direction her career had taken. She had joined the SEALs to fight enemies abroad, never imagining that some of her most important battles would be fought in American institutions against American predators. The work was different from her previous missions, but the core principles remained the same. Protect the innocent, serve justice, and ensure that evil actions have consequences. Whether the enemy wore a foreign uniform or an American one, the mission stayed constant. 3 months ago, Sarah had arrived at the Naval Academy as an undercover instructor with a simple assignment to investigate harassment complaints. Tonight, she was leaving as the leader of a national task force charged with reforming military culture at the highest levels. The cadets who had tried to trap her in those showers thought they were hunting an easy victim. Instead, they had awakened a force of justice that would ultimately transform their entire world. Sometimes the most important victories came not from defeating foreign enemies, but from confronting the darkness within our own institutions. As Sarah drove away from the academy, she was already planning her next move. There were other schools to investigate, other victims to protect, and other predators to stop. The mission was far from over. But thanks to the courage of students like Emma Martinez and the dedication of leaders like Dr. Williams, there was finally hope for real change. The shower incident had been a trap, but not the kind Marcus Webb and his accomplices had intended. They had tried to catch a victim, but instead had been caught by justice itself. And that justice was just getting started.